The year is 1865. The American Civil War has just ended, resulting in the deaths of over 600,000 Americans. Tensions are still high, but many in the North are celebrating the end of the war and cannot wait to return to their family farm to a sense of normalcy. While the South has been devastated economically, they felt a deep sense of defeat, and many needed to rebuild after 4 long years of war. On April 27, 1865, the steamboat Sultana, with 2,127 passengers, mostly recently paroled Union soldiers, exploded, resulting in the worst maritime disaster in American history. The assassination of President Lincoln and the death of John Wilkes Booth the day prior overshadowed the disaster, which caused it to be somewhat forgotten until more recent times. The Sultana was built in 1863 by the John Litherbury Boatyard in Cincinnati, Ohio. She was made from wood and was 260 feet long and 42 feet wide, with a gross registered tonnage of 1,719 pounds. The Sultana had 2 massive paddle wheels on each side, powered by 4 fire tube boilers. Each boiler had 24 flues from the firebox to the chimney, making it harder to clean and easier to clog. The boilers were made from charcoal hammer number 1, a type of wrought iron that became brittle with repeated heating and cooling. The boilers were powered by coal and used water from the Mississippi River that was filled with sediment. During the war, the Sultana steamed between St. Louis and New Orleans. This was her regular route, carrying supplies and Union troops. She had been designed to carry 376 passengers. James Cass Mason, the future captain of the Sultana, was born in Virginia and then grew up in Missouri. He worked on and owned a few steamboats throughout his life. During the war, Mason captained the steamboat Rowena. He was stopped by a Union gunboat and was caught carrying items for the Confederacy. He was imprisoned and his ship was seized, but he was later released. Mason bought a quarter share of the Sultana in 1864. There was more competition now on the river with other steamboats since the Union had control over the Mississippi. The fall of Vicksburg in 1863 gave full access to the Union. Mason was down on one's luck and needed money badly. He sold off some of his shares of the Sultana until he owned just 1/16 of the ship. Prison camps in the South had begun paroling prisoners after Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia had been surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant on April 9, 1865, at Appomattox Courthouse. Union POWs from Cahaba Prison near Selma, Alabama, which had one of the lowest death rates out of any prison, and Andersonville Prison near Andersonville, Georgia, which had the highest death rate out of any prison during the war, had been sent just outside Vicksburg, Mississippi, to a parolee camp. Thousands of Union POWs all waiting until they could be sent north. On April 13th, the Sultana, under command of Captain Mason, steamed downriver from St. Louis towards their final destination in New Orleans. The Sultana arrived in Cairo, Illinois on April 15th. It was here where her crew learned that President Abraham Lincoln had been killed by an assassin's bullet. The telegraph lines were down in many parts of the South, and word could not be sent downriver. Captain Mason picked up as many newspapers as he could and took it upon himself to spread the word about Lincoln's death. The Mississippi River was flooded in April 1865. Some of the levees had been damaged during the war, and they were in disrepair. The spring thaw had sent water rushing towards the south. In some low-lying areas, the river was 3 miles wide. Trees along the banks were almost completely covered by water. The Sultana stopped along the way, giving the heartbreaking news of Lincoln's death. When they reached Vicksburg, the chief quartermaster Reuben Hatch told Captain Mason that there was money to be made in Vicksburg soon. The Union POWs were coming, and the Army was willing to pay steamboat captains for every man they brought north. The Union Army would pay $2.75 for every enlisted man and $8 for any officer. Hatch offered Mason a deal that he could not refuse. He guaranteed that he could have 1,000 men waiting to board the Sultana in return for a cut of the money. Mason was desperate for money, so he agreed to the deal and said that he would return after reaching New Orleans. The Sultana continued downriver, spreading the word of Lincoln's assassination until reaching New Orleans. The Sultana took on supplies, livestock, and 70 paying passengers before leaving New Orleans on April 21st. The Sultana fought her way up the swollen Mississippi River. On her way to Vicksburg, one of the Sultana's boilers sprang a leak. Her crew reduced the pressure in the boilers and limped the ship the rest of the way into Vicksburg on April 23rd. Other steamboats had already arrived, and there was a limited number of POWs waiting to be sent upriver. Mason sent for a mechanic who came down to the docks, climbed on board, and inspected the damage. The mechanic recommended that the blown seam should be cut out and completely replaced, a job that would take a few days to complete. But Captain Mason did not have days. The Union POWs would be gone already on other steamboats if it took that long. Mason and his lead engineer convinced the mechanic to temporarily patch the boiler instead of fixing it. The mechanic hammered the ripped seam flat and then riveted a thinner patch over top of it. The fix was temporary at best, but Mason was struggling financially, and transporting the POWs was his only opportunity to make some quick money. While the repairs were being made, POWs were loaded onto the Sultana. But instead of being loaded with 1,000 POWs, there was a mix-up, and the Sultana was loaded with 1,950 men from the parole camp. Along with the regular passengers, the crew, and the guards, the final number on board was 2,127. Remember, the Sultana was built to hold only 376 passengers. She was now loaded with nearly 6 times that limit. The Sultana was very clearly overloaded. Her decks were completely packed. Many of the POWs were weak and could not even walk by themselves. They crammed into any space that they could find in the ship and on deck. There were so many people on board that the wooden boards on deck began to sag. On April 24, 1865, the Sultana fired the boilers and steamed away from Vicksburg up the swollen Mississippi River. On April 26, Sultana docked at Helena, Arkansas. Thomas W. Banks took a photograph of the crowded side paddle steamer. This would be the final photo ever taken of the ship. Her decks are very clearly overflowing with people. When the photographer arrived, everyone ran on one side of the deck so they could be in the photograph. When they did this, the Sultana began listing badly. Captain Mason eventually regained control and ordered everyone away from the railing. The Sultana then steamed to Memphis, Tennessee, arriving at 7 p.m. She unloaded some supplies and was loaded with coal upriver. She left Memphis at around 1 a.m. on April 27th. She traveled 7 miles upriver when at 2 a.m. her repaired boiler suddenly exploded. 2 more boilers exploded suddenly after. The explosion tore throughout the crowded decks above and throughout the pilot house. Many were killed instantly. Bodies were hurled into the frigid Mississippi. Chaos ensued as the wooden ship began to burn. The smokestacks crashed down, crushing survivors. The ship was now drifting with no way to steer her. The people who were tossed into the water grabbed onto any piece of wreckage that they could find to try and stay afloat. The wind blew the fire to the rear of the ship. People were forced into the water by the flames. The paddle wheels broke off and the ship turned. The flames now were blown towards the front of the ship. The already weak men ripped anything buoyant from the ship and jumped into the water. Men and women struggled in the water. Many did not know how to swim. Many grabbed onto one another, fighting, trying to stay above the surface. After 30 minutes, the steamboat Sultana No. 2 approached the horrific scene. People were in the water, and the ship was engulfed in flames. Passengers and crew grabbed at what they could that was loose on deck and threw it into the water for the survivors to hold on to. The Sultana's captain decided to head to Memphis to try and get help. The survivors who were thrown into the water when the Sultana exploded could not reach shore. The river was much wider due to the flooding. They had drifted so far downstream by this point that they were now entering Memphis. They yelled and pleaded for help. Small boats were sent to help rescue the people that were floating past. It took time for the larger ships to get enough steam to head upriver and assist in the rescue. The flaming Sultana drifted miles downstream. People in the water clung to the treetops or drifted on pieces of wreckage. At around 7 a.m., the Sultana finally sank to the bottom of the Mississippi. Many civilians and military ships joined in the rescue, plucking survivors out of the waters or off flooded rooftops and treetops. 760 survivors were brought to Memphis and distributed to different hospitals. 31 people died in hospital over the following weeks. Many died from hypothermia before they could even be rescued. There were somewhere between 931 and 963 survivors out of the 2,127 on board. The dead floated downriver for hundreds of miles, even as far as Vicksburg. They were finding dead for weeks after the disaster, and many were never found. Captain Mason was among the dead, along with somewhere between 1,100 and 1,600 men, women, and children, with the majority being Union POWs. John Wilkes Booth was found and killed the day before Sultana's sinking, so the disaster, which would normally be front-page news, was pushed to the side, as well as for the ongoing reports on the assassination and the end of the war. The course of the Mississippi has changed since 1865, so the wreckage of the Sultana is believed to be underground in a farm field in Arkansas. This part of the Mississippi is around 2 miles away from its position in 1865. An archaeological expedition found blackened deck planks believed to be from Sultana in 1982. The remains were found at a depth of 32 feet. The Sultana was 260 feet long and 42 feet wide. She was carrying just a little less than the number of passengers the Titanic was carrying when she hit an iceberg on April 14, 1912. Titanic was 882 feet 9 inches long and 92 feet 6 inches wide, almost 3.5 times larger than the little wooden paddle steamer. Sultana has received much more recognition in recent years. Her story will always be remembered. It was greed and corruption which caused the sinking, and all those lives that were thrown away for a quick buck. I want to thank y'all for watching this episode, folks. I hope you enjoyed, and we will see you on the next. Peace.